The letter crumpled in Alma Crawford's fist the moment the door swung open, and the man standing there was absolutely not Hector Briggs. She knew that the instant she looked up, because the man she was supposed to marry had been described to her as short, round-bellied, and balding before 40. The man filling this doorframe was none of those things. He was tall enough that he had to tilt his head slightly to meet her eyes beneath the low wooden beam, broad across the shoulders in a worn chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his dark hair curled just past his collar in a way that suggested he had been too busy for a barber and too unbothered to care. His jaw carried several days of dark stubble, and his eyes, which were the particular pale gray of a sky about to deliver something serious, moved from her face to the carpet bag at her feet to the crumpled letter in her hand, and back again to her face without ever fully leaving her. "You are not Hector Briggs," Alma said, because it was the only honest sentence available to her in that moment. "No," the man agreed. "I am not." The single street of Harlan Creek, Texas stretched behind her in the late afternoon heat of June 1882, and the sun hit the dust in a way that made everything look like it was already on fire. She had ridden the stage from Abilene for 3 days. She had eaten jerked beef that tasted like boot leather and slept upright against a woman with sharp elbows and a tendency to talk in her sleep about her estranged brother Clifford. She had arrived in Harlan Creek with a carpet bag, a trunk she had not yet collected from the stage office, a carefully folded contract that outlined her arrangement with Hector Briggs of 14 Sycamore Road, Harlan Creek, and approximately $11.40 to her name. She was standing at the door of a house that had 14 burned into a wooden number plate above the frame. Sycamore Road. It was the right street, the right number, and entirely the wrong man. "I have come to the wrong house," she said. "Looks that way," the man said. He glanced past her at the empty street, then back at her, and something shifted in his expression that she could not quite name. It was not pity exactly, though it had some of the same qualities. It was more like recognition. "You want to come inside while you figure out where you are supposed to be." Alma Crawford stared at him. In 17 years of sensible living, she had never once walked into the home of a man she did not know. She had been raised in Missouri with very clear ideas about what constituted appropriate behavior for a woman traveling alone, and walking into the home of a handsome stranger in a town where she knew nobody was not on the approved list. Not even close to the approved list. She said yes anyway. It was the heat, partly. It was the exhaustion. It was the fact that the $11.40 felt very small in a very large and indifferent state. But even as she crossed his threshold with her carpet bag and her crumpled letter and her slightly shattered dignity, she understood with the particular clarity that comes only at the most inconvenient moments that this yes was going to change something important about her life. She just did not know yet how much. The story had really started in Missouri, 3 months earlier, in the small city of Sedalia in the spring of 1882. Alma was 24 years old and in possession of certain uncomfortable facts about her situation. Her father, Robert Crawford, had died in February, leaving behind a modest house on a modest street and a set of debts that were neither modest nor polite. The house would have to be sold. Her mother had died when Alma was 12, and her older brother Thomas had moved to Illinois 6 years back, so there was no family to fall into, no soft landing waiting. She had worked as a schoolteacher for 2 years, but the school in Sedalia had hired a man in her place in September, and the next nearest school was not hiring, and the one after that was too far to travel to daily. She had money enough for perhaps 2 months of room and board at the widow Patterson's house on Elm Street, which was a clean and respectable establishment, but not a permanent solution. She had been practical about it in the way that women in difficult circumstances sometimes had to be practical, which was to say she had considered her options without the luxury of pretending they were better than they were. She could find another teaching position, possibly in Kansas, which would require money she did not currently have to travel and establish herself. She could seek employment as a seamstress or a shop clerk, neither of which paid enough to save anything or to make a life from. She could write to Thomas, but Thomas had a wife who did not like her much and 3 children and a mortgage, and she would not do that. Or she could answer one of the advertisements that appeared regularly in the back pages of the Sedalia Gazette under the heading Matrimonial Correspondence. She had told herself she would only look. That looking was not committing to anything. That any sensible woman would at least consider every available door before deciding which one to walk through. Hector Briggs of Harlan Creek, Texas, had written a good letter. That was the honest truth, and she had to give him that much, even now. He wrote in a clear hand which suggested education, and he described himself as a cattle rancher of 32 years, established 6 years in Harlan Creek, with a house and steady income and a need for a wife to manage a household and provide, in his words, companionship and family in time. He was not romantic about it, which Alma had actually appreciated. He was businesslike in a way that felt honest. She had written back. They had exchanged 5 letters over 2 months, each one building a reasonable picture of 2 practical people who might make a reasonable life together. She had not expected to feel particularly swept away by any of it. She had been engaged once before, at 21, to a young man named Daniel Forsyth who had swept her away quite comprehensively and then married a banker's daughter from Jefferson City. She had learned her lesson about being swept away. Reasonable was fine. Reasonable was, in fact, considerably better than the alternative. So she had packed her carpet bag, arranged for the trunk, paid the widow Patterson what she was owed, and boarded the stage to Abilene. The address on Hector Briggs's letters was clear enough. 14 Sycamore Road, Harlan Creek, Texas. What Alma had not accounted for was that her own handwriting, while generally legible, had a tendency to run the words together when she was tired, which she had been when she copied the address into her small leather-covered notebook in the lamplight the night before departure. What she had written was close enough to correct that she had not noticed the error during the 3-day journey, but close enough to correct and correct were, as she was discovering, 2 very different things. Harlan Creek had 2 sycamore roads. Or rather, it had a sycamore road and a sycamore lane, which Alma had recorded in her notebook as Sycamore Road also, because the letters were crammed together in her fatigue, and she had misread her own note. Number 14 Sycamore Lane was where Hector Briggs lived. Number 14 Sycamore Road was where Levi Malone lived. She did not know any of this yet when she stepped inside. The inside of the house was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. It was a ranch house, single-story, built from the pale limestone that this part of Texas seemed to favor, with thick walls that held the cool in a way she immediately appreciated after the scorching street. The main room was large and clean in a functional way, meaning nothing was dirty, but there was no pretense about it either. A big stone hearth on one wall, cold now in June. A heavy oak table with 4 chairs. A wooden shelf unit against the far wall holding a mix of items that caught her attention before she could stop herself looking. 3 books, a tin coffee pot, a coil of rope, a compass, 2 small wooden boxes, and what appeared to be a carved wooden horse about 4 inches tall, very finely made. The man, whose name she still did not know, had set her carpet bag down near the door and moved to the table with the natural ease of someone who was perfectly comfortable in their own space. "Sit down," he said, and pulled a chair out for her with a kind of automatic courtesy that suggested it was simply habit rather than performance. "I will get you some water. You look like you have had a long road." 3 days from Abilene, Alma said. She sat, because she was genuinely tired and because her legs had made the decision before she fully had. "Stage." "Yes." He went to the kitchen alcove at the back of the room, and she heard the sound of a pump handle and water moving. He came back with a tin cup that was full and cold, and she drank half of it immediately. "I am Levi Malone," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the ease of a man who did not feel the need to fill silences unnecessarily. "Alma Crawford." She set the cup down and looked at the crumpled letter in her hand, then spread it on the table and smoothed it flat. "I was trying to find Hector Briggs. He lives on Sycamore Road, number 14. Something passed across Levi Malone's face then. It was brief, and she would not have caught it except she was watching him directly, and she was the kind of person who noticed things. It was not quite a shadow, it was more like a held breath. "Hector Briggs lives on Sycamore Lane," Levi said carefully. "Number 14. This is Sycamore Road." Alma looked at the letter again. Then she took out her small leather notebook and opened it to the page where she had copied the address in her tired nighttime handwriting, and she held the two side by side, and she saw it. Road and lane, mushed together in her own exhausted script until they looked identical. She had ridden 3 days and walked the length of the wrong street and knocked on the wrong door because of a single word she had misread in her own handwriting. She was quiet for a moment. "Well," she finally said. Levi Malone watched her with those pale gray eyes, and she had the unsettling feeling that he was reading something in her expression that she had not chosen to show him. "Sycamore Lane is about a quarter-mile east," he said. "You can leave your bag here until you have sorted yourself out over there if you want." It was a practical offer, plainly stated, no particular weight to it. But it sat in the room between them with more weight than it should have, because Alma was suddenly aware of a complicated feeling moving through her chest that had nothing to do with Hector Briggs and everything to do with the way the light was falling through the west window of this stranger's house, and the way the carved wooden horse sat on the shelf as if it had always been there waiting for her to notice it. She pushed the feeling firmly to one side. "Thank you," she said. "I should go and find the right house." "Of course," Levi said. He stood when she stood, which she noted. "Do you know what he looks like, Briggs?" "Short," she said. "Round." "Brown hair," he wrote, "though I gather there is not much of it left." Levi made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite not one. "That would be him. He has a house with a green door. You will not miss it." Alma picked up her bag. She crossed to the door and opened it, and the Texas heat came back at her like a wall. She was halfway across the threshold when she turned back, because something in her would not let her leave without asking. "The wooden horse on your shelf," she said. "Did you make that?" Levi glanced at the shelf as if he had half forgotten it was there. Then he looked back at her. "Yes," he said. She nodded once, as if this confirmed something she had not known she was asking about, and walked out into the afternoon. The green door on Sycamore Lane was easy enough to find. Hector Briggs opened it himself, and she saw immediately that his letters had been honest enough. He was short, and he was round, and his brown hair had indeed retreated significantly from his forehead. He had small, quick dark eyes, and a mouth that smiled with the lower part of his face, without involving the upper part. A kind of smile that Alma recognized as the smile of someone who had learned that smiling was expected, but had never quite internalized the reason for it. He seemed pleased to see her in the same way one was pleased to see a delivery arrive. "Miss Crawford," he said, "I expected you an hour ago." "I had some difficulty with the address," she said, which was true, and told him nothing he needed to act upon. He showed her the house. It was larger than Levi Malone's, with more furniture and considerably less personality. The chairs were newer and stiffer, the walls were bare, and the kitchen was clean in the way of a place where food was heated rather than cooked. He showed her the room that would be hers until the wedding, which was 3 weeks away by the plan they had made in their letters, and he pointed out where things were, and told her the rhythm of the ranch schedule with the efficiency of a man briefing an employee. Then he told her he had supper waiting, which turned out to be cold beans and cornbread that his ranch hand Miguel had apparently left before departing for the evening. They ate mostly in silence, which Alma spent examining her feelings with the thoroughness of someone who prided herself on clear-sightedness. Hector Briggs was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was not exciting or warm or particularly interesting, but she had not come here expecting any of those things. She had come here expecting a reasonable arrangement with a functional man, and he was that. She looked at his small, quick eyes and his lower-face smile, and told herself firmly that warmth was not a prerequisite for a satisfactory life. that plenty of women had built solid and dignified existences on the foundation of reasonable arrangements, and that what she was feeling was simply the ordinary anxiety of arriving somewhere new. She went to bed early and lay in the dark of the spare room listening to the sounds of a Texas night, which were different from Missouri nights in ways she could not immediately identify but felt in her bones. She thought, before she slept, briefly and against her better judgment, about pale gray eyes and a carved wooden horse. The next morning she walked back to Sycamore Road. She told herself it was to retrieve her carpet bag, which she had left at Levi Malone's house because she had been flustered, and because it was genuinely still there. That was true. What was also true was that she had woken up at 5 in the morning with the specific alertness of someone whose sleeping mind had been busy with something, and had lain there watching the pale bloom of dawn through the curtain, thinking about nothing she could precisely name, until she got up and washed her face and walked east. He was in the yard when she arrived, feeding 2 horses at the fence of a small corral. He heard her coming on the gravel and turned, and she was aware again of the same quiet steadiness he had shown yesterday, as if he were the same person this morning as he had been in the afternoon, and she was somehow surprised by that. "Came for my bag," she said. "I figured." He gave the second horse the last of what he was carrying and wiped his hands on his trousers and walked with her inside. The bag was where she had left it, near the door. She picked it up and stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. "Did you find Briggs?" he asked. "I did." She adjusted the handle of the bag. "He is as described." Levi leaned against the table with his arms crossed, and he was looking at her with that reading something expression again, the one she did not entirely know what to do with. And what? Are you satisfied?" It was a direct question, and she held it up in her mind and turned it around and examined it with the honesty she applied to uncomfortable things. "It is early days," she said, which was not an answer, and they both knew it. Something moved in his face, not the shadow this time, something more complicated and less easily named. "I grew up near Harlan Creek," he said, apparently changing the subject though she was not sure he was. "Left for 5 years. Came back 3 years ago." Harlan Creek is a place where everybody knows everything about everybody, more or less. "I see," Alma said. "Briggs came here about 4 years ago from Georgia. He runs cattle, which he does well enough. He keeps to himself." Levi paused. "He had a housekeeper for about 2 years. Woman named Agnes. She left last winter." Alma was quiet. She understood what he was doing, offering her information that would be genuinely useful without editorializing too obviously about it. She appreciated the subtlety and was not entirely sure she appreciated the information itself. "Why did Agnes leave?" she asked. "She did not say. She just packed up one morning and left." "I do not think she was mistreated," Levi said carefully. "I think she was simply not happy." Alma nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me that. Just Harlan Creek being Harlan Creek," he said. She walked back to Sycamore Lane in the fresh morning, with her bag and the information she had not asked for but found she was grateful to have. She told herself the gratitude was for the information specifically, and not for the man who had offered it, which was mostly true. The weeks before a wedding in a small Texas town in 1882 were not idle. There were practical matters. A meeting with the Reverend Aldous Kemp at the First Methodist Church, who had a gentle manner and very full white eyebrows that moved independently when he spoke. There was the matter of the dress, for which Alma had brought 2 good dresses from Missouri and planned to alter one of them with new ribbon from the general store. There was the business of learning the household, the ranch schedule, the names of Hector's 2 ranch hands, Miguel Ruiz, and a quiet young man of 20 named Peter Sauls who barely spoke but worked hard. And there was the matter of Harlan Creek itself, which she explored methodically in the way that she approached most things, on foot, block by block, with her eyes open. The town had about 340 residents according to the census that was posted, interestingly, in the window of the barber's shop. It had a general store run by a man named Arthur Foss and his wife Delia, who was the kind of woman who made you feel immediately that she had been waiting for you to arrive and was genuinely glad you had. It had the Methodist church and a smaller Baptist church 2 streets over. It had a saloon on the main street, the Painted Stone, which Alma observed from a safe distance. It had a land office, a doctor's office occupied by a young physician named Dr. Isaac Reeves, who had graduated from a college in Ohio and seemed slightly bewildered by the dust, a post office, a livery stable, and a schoolhouse. The schoolhouse was closed for summer, but through the window she could see the neat rows of desks and the big slate board at the front and the globe on the teacher's desk, and she felt the specific ache of missing something that was still technically available to her, but felt suddenly very far away. She had been standing there for perhaps 2 minutes when Levi Malone appeared beside her. She had seen him 3 times in the first week after her arrival, which in a town of 340 people was not entirely surprising, but she was aware each time of a small bright awareness going through her that she could not entirely attribute to coincidence. "You taught school?" he asked, looking through the window alongside her. "In Sedalia, 2 years." She stepped back from the window with something she hoped looked like casual interest rather than longing. "Who teaches here?" "There has not been a permanent teacher since September. A man named Fowler. He went to Denver." Levi glanced at her sideways. "The town has been looking." Alma absorbed that information carefully. "I imagine Hector would not want his wife teaching school." "I imagine Hector would want what was useful," Levi said, and then seemed to hear how that sounded and said nothing else. They walked back along the main street together because they happened to be going in the same direction, and they talked about nothing of particular consequence. The summer heat, the cattle ranches that made up most of the economy in this county, a drought that had hit 2 years back and left marks in the grass that were still visible if you knew where to look. It was easy conversation, the kind that does not cost much and leaves you feeling somehow richer for it anyway. And when they parted ways at the corner of Main and Sycamore, she walked the remaining quarter-mile to the green door, feeling the specific kind of confused that comes from wanting things to be simpler than they are. Hector noticed nothing particular about her mood, which was both a relief and its own information. 10 days before the wedding, Delia Foss from the general store invited her to a sewing circle that met on Thursday evenings at the church hall, and Alma went because she was not the kind of person who refused invitations when she was trying to learn a new place. There were 7 women there, ranging from Delia herself, who was perhaps 40 and had a laugh that started somewhere near her shoes, to a young woman of 19 named Ruth Pickard who had been married for a year and had a baby on her hip and a quality of exhausted happiness that Alma found genuinely moving. The other women were a mixture of ages and temperaments, and they were all, without exception, curious about the woman who had come from Missouri to marry Hector Briggs. They were polite about it, but the curiosity was there, underneath the politeness, visible in the way questions were asked and in the particular attention paid to her answers. It was Ruth Pickard, the youngest of them, who asked the thing the others had been circling around. "Do you love him?" Ruth asked, with the directness of someone who had not yet learned that the question was considered impolite. The room went briefly quiet. Delia made a small sound that was either a cough or a rebuke. "Ruth," said one of the other women. "I only ask because I could not have done it without love," Ruth said, not unkindly but without backing down. "Caleb and I had love from the start, and even so it is hard sometimes. I wonder how it would be without it." Alma looked at the half-finished seam in her hands. "We have an arrangement," she said, which was honest and said everything without saying too much. Ruth nodded as if she had already known the answer and felt sad about it. And then someone changed the subject to the price of cotton thread, and the moment passed. But it stayed with Alma on the walk home, and she was still turning it when she passed the end of Sycamore Road in the dark and saw the warm square of lamplight in the window of Levi Malone's house, and she kept walking, The problem, she acknowledged to herself in the private court of her own most honest thinking, was not Hector Briggs. The problem was that in the 10 days she had spent in Harlan Creek, she had been in Levi Malone's company approximately 8 times, for a total of perhaps 6 hours, and she had come to know him in that time in some essential way that she could not fully account for by the number of hours alone. She knew that he had grown up on a small farm outside town, and that his father had been a horse breaker, and his mother had been from a family that had been in Texas since before statehood. She knew that he had left Harlan Creek at 22 and gone north, to Colorado and then Wyoming, working cattle drives and then spending 2 years doing something he had not been specific about. And she knew from the careful way he sometimes chose his words and the occasional particular stillness that came over him that the unnamed 2 years held something he did not offer lightly. She knew he had come back at 27, bought the limestone house and the small corral and the 2 horses, and was running cattle on leased land 3 miles north of town. She knew he read when he had time, which explained the books on the shelf, and that he carved wood as a habit rather than a profession, which explained the horse and the 2 other small figures she had noticed on a second visit, a dog and what appeared to be a woman standing with her arms slightly out as if about to catch something. She knew, most inconveniently, that he was 30 years old and not married, and that nobody in Harlan Creek seemed to know quite why. She asked Delia Foss about it obliquely, disguised inside a broader question about who was who in town, and Delia told her with the careful honesty of someone who liked Levi Malone, and was choosing her words accordingly, that he had been engaged once, 2 years back, to a woman named Clara Hewitt who had come from San Antonio and had been beautiful and restless, and had gone back to San Antonio after 4 months without marrying him, and that after that Levi had become the person he currently was. Meaning self-sufficient, pleasant, not seeking anything. He is a good man, Delia said, with the weight of someone who meant more by it than the simple words. One of the genuinely good ones. Not a lot of those. Alma had thanked her and bought a spool of thread and left, and not thought about it obsessively at all, which was entirely a lie. But she was at least lying to herself in motion, rather than lying to herself standing still. 8 days before the wedding, she was at the general store in the early morning when the door opened and Levi came in with a list in his hand, and stopped when he saw her with a small involuntary expression that he covered almost instantly, but not quite fast enough. That expression, those half-second unguarded looks, were the most inconvenient thing about Levi Malone. He was careful. He was controlled. He knew perfectly well that she was here to marry another man, and he respected that in the plainest and most obvious way, by not saying or doing anything that crossed any line. But those half-second expressions were outside the control he exercised over his words and his behavior, and she catalogued each one with a precision she was not entirely proud of. They bought their respective things and walked out together and stood in the morning sun for a moment. "I want to show you something," Levi said. He said it simply, as a statement of fact rather than as any kind of invitation, and she understood from his tone that it was something he thought she would genuinely want to see rather than something he was using as a reason to spend time with her, and that made it harder to say no and also easier to say yes for the right reasons. "What is it?" she asked. "There is a canyon about 2 miles east," he said. "The creek runs through it. It is something worth seeing once if you are going to live here." She hesitated for exactly the length of time it took her to remember that she was a grown woman, and looking at a canyon with a neighbor was not a transgression of any kind. "All right," she said. They rode out on his 2 horses in the early morning cool, and he was right that it was worth seeing. The canyon was modest by the standards of West Texas canyon country, but it was beautiful in the specific way of places that feel like they have been there since before anything else. The red limestone walls and the silver thread of creek below, and the way the light fell into it in bars that moved slowly as the sun shifted. They left the horses at the rim and scrambled down a path on the south wall, and at the bottom the air was 10 degrees cooler, and the sound of the water was the only sound. They sat on the flat rocks beside the creek for a long time without much talk, and it was the most comfortable silence Alma had experienced since before her father died, the kind of silence that two people can only share when they are somehow the same kind of quiet inside, and she recognized it and wished she did not. "You could teach here," Levi said eventually into the quiet. "The school needs a teacher." That is Reverend Kemp's decision. Partly. Mostly it is the school board's decision. There are 3 of them. He picked up a flat stone and turned it in his fingers. One of them is Arthur Foss. He would vote yes for you without hesitation. I know the other 2 well enough. If someone were to ask them on your behalf, I think they would consider it seriously. Alma looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" He met her gaze and held it with the particular directness that was simply part of how he looked at the world, that she had noticed on the very first moment in the doorway. "Because you lit up like a lantern when you looked through that school window," he said, "and because you deserve to have something that is yours and not just part of somebody else's arrangement." It was the most direct thing he had said to her in 8 days of careful indirection, and it landed in her chest with the weight of something much more significant than its words. "Levi," she said. "I know," he said immediately before she could form whatever she had been about to say. He looked back at the water. "I know what your situation is. I am not suggesting anything. I just thought you should know the option exists." She was quiet for a long time. The creek moved over the stones with its ancient indifference to human complications. "The carved figure," she said, "the woman on your shelf with her arms out." He was still for a moment. "What about her? Who is she?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Nobody specific. She is just someone I made one night because I was thinking about a particular kind of courage. The kind where you do not know what is coming toward you, but you hold your arms out for it anyway." Alma looked at the water and felt something shift in her chest that she had no appropriate response to. They rode back to town in the late morning and parted ways at the corner, and Alma went to Hector Briggs's house with the green door and made the bread she had promised to make for the week. And she was methodical and precise about it, and she kneaded the dough with more energy than was strictly necessary. 6 days before the wedding, Hector Briggs said something that changed things. They were at supper, she and Hector, and he was talking about the cattle and the summer pasture rotation in the way he often talked at supper, which was efficiently and without apparent interest in her response to the information. Then he said, in the same efficient tone, "I heard you went out to the canyon with Malone this morning." Alma set down her fork. "I did. He offered to show me the canyon. It seemed a sensible thing to see if I am to live here." Hector's small dark eyes moved over her face with a calculation that she had not seen before, or perhaps had not been paying close enough attention to see. "Malone is a man with a talent for seeming harmless," he said. "I would advise you not to spend time with him." The sentence was delivered quietly and without obvious emotion, but it carried something in it that she did not like, a proprietary certainty that she recognized as the early edge of a particular kind of control. "We are not married yet," she said, equally quietly. "I walked to a canyon with a neighbor." "You are in my house," Hector said, "and you came here to be my wife. I think that warrants some consideration." She looked at him across the table, and she thought about what Delia had said about Agnes packing up one morning after 2 years and leaving without a word. She thought about the way Ruth Pickard had asked the question, and the sad small nod when Alma had said arrangement. She thought about the specific tone in which Hector had just told her what to do with her free time 5 days before they had even exchanged vows. She said nothing, because she was not yet ready to say what she needed to say, and she did not want to say something careless. She finished supper and washed the dishes and went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the long Texas evening light and thought hard and carefully about the truth of her situation. She was not in love with Hector Briggs. She had known that since she arrived, in the quiet, honest place where she kept the things she did not say aloud. She had told herself it did not matter, that love was not a prerequisite for a functional partnership, and that was genuinely true for some people in some circumstances. But there was a difference between an absence of love and an absence of warmth, and what she had seen in Hector's eyes tonight over the supper table was not the warmth of a man who did not yet know her well enough to love her. It was the cool appraisal of a man who did not particularly intend to. She also acknowledged, with uncomfortable honesty, that whatever she felt when she was around Levi Malone was not a neutral thing. It was not practical or reasonable or appropriate to what her situation was, but it was real, and pretending it was not real had started to feel like the kind of lie that costs more than it saves. She sat with all of that for a long time. Then she made a decision. She went to find Levi Malone the next morning before Hector was up. He was outside as he usually was, working at the fence of the corral with a length of wire, and he saw her coming and went still in the way he sometimes did when she appeared, a stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness in a way she now knew exactly how to read. "I need to talk to you," she said. "All right." They went inside and she sat at his table, which she had now sat at enough times that it had stopped feeling like a stranger's table, and she told him what Hector had said. She told it plain and in sequence and without editorial, the way she had learned to present difficult information in her 2 years of teaching when a child needed to understand something complicated. Levi listened with his hands flat on the table and his face still. "He told you not to see me," he said when she finished. "He told me not to spend time with you, yes, and you came here. I came here because I needed to think clearly, and I find I think more clearly here than I do over there." She met his eyes. "And because I am not someone who is told what to do before there is any right to tell me." Something moved in Levi's expression that was not the half-second involuntary kind. This was a slower, deeper movement, like something rising from a considerable depth. He looked at her steadily for a long moment. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Whether I am making a terrible mistake," she said. "Which one?" "The arrangement," she said. Then, after a breath, "Or rather I am thinking about whether I am still willing to make it." The room was very quiet. Outside, one of the horses made a sound at the fence. "Alma," Levi said, and the way he said her name was different from every other time he had said it, not cautious or careful but direct and full, as if he had been holding the weight of it and was only now setting it down where she could see it. "If you are asking me whether I think you should walk away from that arrangement, I cannot answer that for you. But if you are asking me whether I think you would be happy there, then I will be honest with you because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort." "I am asking you to be honest," she said. "I have watched you every time you come back from that house," he said. "You come back smaller. Not immediately, not in a way most people would notice. But you come back a little smaller every time, and I think you are the kind of person who should never be smaller. I think you are the kind of person who fills up the space they are in." Alma was very still. "I also think," Levi said more quietly, "that you already know the answer to what you are asking yourself. And I think you knew it before you came here this morning. And I think the only thing you needed was one person to say out loud that you are allowed to know it." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the west window and falling across the table between them and across the carved horse on the shelf and the woman with her arms out, and the room felt very full of everything neither of them was saying yet. "What happened in the 2 years you were away?" she said. "The time you have not talked about." He was quiet. His jaw tightened once and then released. "I worked for a man in Wyoming who ran his business through a combination of legal cattle trading and considerably less legal activities involving land that belonged to people who had no way to protect their claim to it. I did not know the full picture when I took the job. I found out over time." He looked at his hands. "When I understood what was happening, I had a choice between staying because it was safe and leaving because it was right. Leaving was not simple or clean, but I made it. Came back here." She waited. "The 2 years felt like a very long time to live with a dark past," he said, meeting her eyes. "I am careful about what I build now because I know the cost of building on the wrong ground." Something in Alma's chest broke open in a way that was not painful but was large, a spreading warmth like the first day of spring arriving, while winter is still technically in progress. She understood, looking at him in that morning light, that this was the thing she had been circling around for 8 days and had been refusing to look directly at, not because she was afraid of it exactly, but because she had not given herself permission. She gave herself permission now. "I am going to break the arrangement with Hector Briggs," she said. Levi looked at her steadily. "Are you certain?" "Yes," she said. "I have been certain since 2 mornings after I arrived. I have just been arguing with myself about the practical complications." "What will you do?" he asked. "Where will you go?" "I have $11.40, she said, which made him almost smile. "And I am a qualified schoolteacher in a town that needs a schoolteacher. And I am a capable adult woman with a willingness to work for whatever I need." She looked at him. "I will manage." "I know you will," Levi said. And the way he said it, simple and direct and completely without doubt, was one of the most moving things anyone had ever said to her. She went and told Hector Briggs that afternoon. He did not take it well, but he did not take it badly in any way that threatened her, which she had been quietly prepared for. He was cold about it, clipped and controlled, and he said several things about wasted time and foolishness, and the difficulties of trusting a woman who could not keep her arrangements, and she listened to all of it without flinching, and said she was sorry for the disruption, and that she wished him no ill. And then she collected her things from the spare room, including her trunk, which had been brought from the stage office. And she walked out of the green door with the same calm she had carried across the threshold, and that was that. She went to Reverend Kemp and explained, with the directness she had decided to commit to, that the arrangement with Hector Briggs was ended, and that she was in need of a room while she sought employment. Reverend Kemp had very kind eyes under the dramatic white eyebrows, and he made no judgment, and sent her to a widow named Mrs. Ellen Hartley, who kept 2 spare rooms and was glad of the company and the income. She went to Delia Foss and told her she was interested in the school position. Delia, who knew everything that happened in Harlan Creek, looked at her with a smile that had something older and more knowing in it than an ordinary smile, and said she would speak to Arthur and that Arthur would speak to the board. Then Alma went to see Levi. He was at the corral and he had clearly been working. There was dust on his shirt, and he had his hat off and his hair was slightly disheveled. And when he saw her coming, his whole face changed in a way that was no longer quick or hidden or half-second. He let it happen, and she saw it happening, and something in her chest saying, "It is done," she said. "How are you?" he asked. "Surprisingly fine," she said. "Almost embarrassingly fine, honestly. I thought it would feel worse." "Sometimes when you stop carrying the wrong thing you only feel the lightness," he said. She was standing 2 feet from him, and the afternoon was golden and the horses were shifting at the fence, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and there was a moment, clear and brief and absolute, where they both simply acknowledged what was happening between them without saying anything at all. Then Levi said, "Can I call on you? Properly, I mean." "While you are at Mrs. Hartley's." Alma smiled at him, a full smile, not the careful partial one she had been distributing for the past 10 days. "Yes," she said. "You can call on me." He called on her the next evening, and they sat on Mrs. Hartley's porch in the late light and talked for 2 hours about everything, Texas history and Missouri winter, and the books they had each read, and the things they both believed about how a person ought to live. And Mrs. Hartley brought them lemonade and retreated with the cheerful tact of a woman who had seen enough of life to know when to leave 2 people alone. The school board met on a Tuesday, and Alma sat in the back of the meeting room at the church hall while Arthur Foss and 2 men named Garrison and Whitmore listened to her describe her qualifications and her approach to teaching. And she was thorough and composed and answered every question directly. And at the end of it, Martin Garrison, who was 60 and had 3 grandchildren, said he thought she would do very well, and the vote was 3-0 in her favor. She had a job. She had a room at Mrs. Hartley's. She had $11.40 plus the prospect of a teacher's wage of $28 a month when the school year began in September. She had, most significantly, the specific clear happiness of a person who has made the right decision. Summer in Harlan Creek in 1882 moved with the particular rhythm of a place where the heat was the central fact of daily life, and everything else organized itself around managing or ignoring it. Levi called on her 3 times a week, and then 4, and then every evening, and the evenings stretched from an hour on the porch to 2 hours to 3. And Mrs. Hartley stopped bringing lemonade and started going to bed early with a discretion that Alma appreciated deeply. They rode out to the canyon again, and this time they climbed down to the creek, and she took off her boots and waded in the shallows while he sat on the flat rock and watched her with an expression that was so openly full of feeling that she waded back to him and sat beside him and said, "What are you thinking?" And he said, "I am thinking that I am glad you misread that address." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that starts somewhere unexpected and takes over the body. "I almost did not," she said. "I almost got back on the stage and went to find the right house, and I sat in your doorway for 5 extra seconds deciding whether to go back." "What made you stay?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "The horse," she said, "the carved horse on the shelf. It told me something about you before you said anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and brought out a small wooden figure newly finished, the wood pale and smooth. It was a woman, not the one with arms out, a different one, this one mid-step with her chin up in the way of someone walking toward something on purpose. He put it in her hand without a word. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed her fingers around it and looked at him, and he looked back and the light on the water moved between them, and she leaned the last 6 inches across the space between them and kissed him. And he kissed her back with all the gentleness and intensity of a man who had been waiting with extreme patience for exactly this. They sat by the creek for a long time afterward in the particular silence of 2 people who have crossed a threshold and are taking a quiet moment to register the fact. August came, and with it a letter from Hector Briggs's land, a rumor that circulated through Harlan Creek with the efficiency of a small town and arrived to Alma via Delia Foss. Hector had placed another matrimonial advertisement. By the following week, there was a new woman expected from Georgia by the end of the month. Alma felt nothing about this except a mild hope that the woman from Georgia had been given accurate information about what she was walking into, and a resolution to befriend her if the opportunity arose. Levi and Alma began talking about the future with a naturalness that neither of them commented on directly, because it was the kind of conversation that works best when you do not announce that you are having it. They talked about the school year, which she was looking forward to with a hunger for the work that she had been missing for 2 years. They talked about his cattle operation, which was small but profitable enough, and which he was thinking of expanding with 2 additional leases in the spring. They talked about the limestone house on Sycamore Road and the corral and the 2 horses, and she said she liked the house very much, and he said good because it was a solid house and could be added to if needed. And they looked at each other for a moment and then went on talking about something else without acknowledgement of what they had just not quite said. On a Friday evening in late August, Levi took her to the Painted Stone Saloon, which she had previously only observed from a distance, because there was a man there on Friday evenings who played the fiddle, and Levi said she needed to hear this man play before summer was over. They went in together, and several people who knew them both took notice with the particular delight of a small town that follows its own romantic developments with the attention of a dedicated audience. And Delia Foss, who was there with her husband at a table near the bar, gave Alma a smile so full of told-you-so warmth that Alma had to look away to stop herself from laughing. The fiddle player was a man of about 60 named Old Caleb Moore, no relation to the young Ruth Pickard's husband, and he played with a joy that was completely unself-conscious and entirely overwhelming. He played fast songs that made the room stomp and slow songs that made the room lean into whoever was nearest, and Levi put his hand out when the first slow song started, and she took it, and they danced in the small cleared space near the wall with a dozen other couples, and she felt the full reality of where she was, and who she was with, and the complete improbability of the journey that had deposited her here, on a Friday night in a Texas saloon, holding the hand of a man she had met by accident through a misread word in her own handwriting. There was a particular kind of grace in accidents she was coming to believe. Not all of them, obviously. But some of them were not accidents at all in any meaningful sense. Some of them were the right outcome arriving by a route that nobody would have predicted. September came and the school opened. There were 22 children in Alma's classroom, ranging from 6 to 14, and they were a fascinating, difficult, wonderful collection of human beings. There were the children of cattle ranchers and of the general store owner, and of 3 Mexican families who had been in the county since before the American settlement. And she took seriously the responsibility of making the classroom a place that belonged equally to all of them, which required some careful navigation, and more than one direct conversation with parents who had ideas about curricula that she politely but firmly declined to accommodate. Levi came to the schoolhouse one afternoon in the first week to bring her a book from his shelf that he thought might be useful for the older students, a history of the Texas Territory published in 1878, and he stood in the doorway of the empty classroom after the children had gone, and looked at her at the front of the room with her chalk-dusted hands and her hair slightly escaped from its pins. And she saw that expression on his face again, the open one, the one he no longer tried to cover. "You are good at this," he said. "I know," she said, and it was not arrogance. It was the simple, clear knowledge of a person doing the thing they were built to do. He proposed to her on the first Sunday in October. He did not do it with any theatrical arrangement. He was simply walking with her on the path above the canyon rim in the early evening, and he stopped and turned to face her and said, "I want to marry you, Alma. I want to build something with you here that is ours, that is built on the right ground and lasts because of that." He reached into his jacket pocket and brought out a ring, a simple gold band with a small setting, and he said, "This was my mother's. She gave it to me before she died, and she told me to give it to someone worth giving it to. You are the most worth it person I have ever known." Alma looked at the ring in his palm, and then at his face, and the canyon stretched away behind him in the October light, all that red stone and deep shadow, and the silver thread of water far below. "Yes," she said, the same word she had said in his doorway 4 months ago, and it was still the most right word she had. He put the ring on her finger, and she kissed him with the thoroughness of someone who was both deeply happy and very certain. And he held her in the canyon light for a long time, and the horses waited quietly at the top of the path, and the evening came on around them. They married in November at the First Methodist Church with Reverend Kemp officiating, and his eyebrows were extremely active throughout the ceremony, which Alma found genuinely heartwarming. Delia Foss cried openly from the third pew, which she made no apology for. Arthur Foss sat beside her looking pleased in the particular quiet way of someone who has done something small in the background, his vote on the school board, and is satisfied with how it has turned out. Ruth Pickard came with her husband and her baby, who slept through the vows with admirable tranquility. Miguel Ruiz and Peter Sauls, Hector Briggs's former ranch hands, were not there, but half of Harlan Creek was, because in a town of 340 people, a wedding drew a crowd whether it was intended to or not. Levi stood at the front of the church in a dark coat and a clean white shirt, and looked at her walking toward him with an expression so open and full that she felt it from 20 feet away. She had made her older dress into a wedding dress with new lace at the collar and the cuffs, and she had her hair up properly for once with small flowers that Delia had pressed from her garden, and she walked down that aisle alone because there was no one to give her away, which in this particular instance felt entirely right, because she was not being given to anyone. She was arriving on her own terms, which was exactly as it should be. The vows they exchanged were the traditional ones because neither of them felt the need to improve on them. Levi's voice was steady and quiet and direct when he made his promises, the same way he spoke about everything, and she made hers with the same clarity, and when Reverend Kemp pronounced them, married Levi kissed her with a gentleness that made the room collectively take a breath. They went home to the limestone house on Sycamore Road, which was hers now as much as his, and she stood in the main room and looked at the fireplace and the heavy oak table and the shelf with the books and the tin coffee pot and the carved wooden figures, including the woman with her arms out and the woman mid-step with her chin up, and she felt the deep settled rightness of a person who has arrived at the place they were always moving toward even before they knew it existed. That winter was a good one. Not easy in the way of soft things. The winters in West Texas in 1882 had a cold that bit differently from Missouri cold, drier and more insistent, and there was work to the days that was physical and constant. The cattle operation needed tending even in cold months, and the school continued through December because the school board had decided that Harlan Creek children needed a longer school year, a decision that Alma fully agreed with and had in fact suggested. But it was good in the way of things that have their own inherent rightness, the warmth of the hearth in the evenings, and the weight of Levi's arm across her in the mornings, and the particular quality of conversation between two people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds. She carved her own small figure over 3 evenings in December using a penknife and a piece of cedar from the woodpile, a rough thing compared to his graceful work but recognizable. A man in a doorway, half-turned, beginning to ask someone inside. She gave it to him on Christmas morning and he looked at it for a long time without speaking, and then he put it on the shelf next to the woman with her arms out and they stood together and looked at them both. "We should have a whole shelf of them eventually," she said. "We will," he said. February brought news from Hector Briggs. He had married the woman from Georgia, whose name was Loretta, at the New Year. Alma heard this from Delia and wished them both genuinely well, with the uncomplicated benevolence that comes from being thoroughly at peace with one's own life. She also learned from Delia that Loretta was a woman of formidable personality and considerable opinions, which Delia delivered with a kind of delighted neutrality that suggested she was looking forward to seeing how that particular arrangement progressed. Spring came on hard and fast the way it did in this part of Texas, winter to summer in what felt like 6 weeks, and with it, the expansion of Levi's cattle operation. He had secured 2 additional leases, as he had planned, and the operation grew from manageable to requiring reliable help, and he hired 2 men, a quiet and competent Texan named Ford Harris who was 35 and had been cowboying his whole life, and a younger man of 23 named Ezekiel Torres whose family ran a neighboring property, and who turned out to be extraordinarily good with horses in a way that reminded Alma of what Levi had said about his own father. The school year ended in June with a small end-of-year gathering for the families in the church hall, where the children performed recitations and exhibited their work, and Alma stood at the back watching 22 children talk with pride about the things they had learned, and the feeling in her chest was enormous. Levi stood beside her through the whole thing with his hand light at the small of her back, and when the last recitation was done and the families were gathered in the hall eating cake and talking, he leaned down and said quietly near her ear, "You have changed things for some of these children." "I know," she said. "That is why we do it." He turned to look at her, and his expression was that particular one, full and open, the one that had once been involuntary and guarded, and was now simply the face he wore when he looked at her. "I love you," he said, which was a thing they had been saying to each other for months but still arrived with freshness every time. "I love you," she said. July 1883 brought a discovery that made everything bigger and more complicated and more wonderful in equal measure, which was that Alma was going to have a baby. She had suspected for 2 weeks before she said anything, examining the evidence with her typical careful thoroughness before bringing it to the conversation. And when she told Levi, he went very still for a long moment in the way that she had learned meant he was receiving something significant and organizing himself around it. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, something new, something that was made of equal parts wonder and a kind of fierce protectiveness, and a joy so large it seemed to be looking for more room than his face could offer. He said her name, just that, Alma. And then he pulled her into his arms and held her carefully, the careful hold of someone who is very aware of what they are holding. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt tears that were entirely happy ones moving down her face. Dr. Isaac Reeves, still slightly bewildered by the dust but considerably more competent than his first-year anxiousness had suggested, confirmed the pregnancy in August and told her January, which was several months after the school year would end for the holidays. Good timing, Delia said emphatically when told. Delia received the news as if she had a proprietary interest in it, which in some ways she felt she did. The autumn of 1883 was a season of particular beauty that Alma would always remember afterward as the most contentedly happy stretch of days she had ever lived. The school with its 22 children and its chalk and its globe on the teacher's desk. The evenings with Levi at the heavy oak table, planning and talking and reading. The Saturday mornings when they rode out to the canyon and sat by the water, and she read to him from whatever book she was currently working through while he carved, a new figure taking shape from a piece of cedar or mesquite, these days most of them with some reference to a child or a family, small horses and small figures standing close together. The Sunday afternoons with Delia and Arthur Foss, and sometimes Ruth Pickard and her husband and their growing toddler, gathered on someone's porch with coffee, and the kind of conversation that moves naturally between the serious and the light. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been 18 months ago, sitting at the widow Patterson's house in Sedalia counting $11.40, and looking at the back pages of the Gazette with a feeling that was not quite despair, but was its close enough neighbor. About the stage journey, and the woman with sharp elbows who dreamed about Clifford. About the afternoon light on Sycamore Road and the door swinging open on the wrong man, the right man, the only one who could have been the right one. She thought about how small the error had been, one word, road instead of lane, her own tired handwriting conspiring with her own tired eyes to send her to the wrong door. About how enormous the difference between road and lane had turned out to be. About whether she believed in accidents, or whether she believed in a kind of intentionality that arranged itself through exactly this kind of ordinary small mistake. She came down on the side of both, finally. She believed that it was an accident, genuinely and without any particular design behind it, and that it was also exactly right, and that both of those things could be true simultaneously without contradiction. The baby was born on a cold night in January 1884, a boy, healthy and loud, and with a remarkable amount of dark hair for a newborn, which made Delia Foss laugh when she came the next morning. Levi had been there through all of it with Dr. Reeves, and she had held his hand through the hardest parts, and he had held hers back without flinching. And when the baby arrived and the crying began, he had looked at his son, with an expression that she catalogued carefully, because it was new. Another new one to add to the collection of expressions she had been observing and archiving since she first stood in his doorway and watched him read her face. This expression was entirely his own. There was no word for it that she knew. It was what it looked like when a man who had been careful with what he built, because he knew the cost of the wrong foundation, looked at the first and most irreducible piece of evidence that the foundation was right. They named him James Robert Malone, James for Levi's father and Robert for her own. Mrs. Hartley came to see him and cried. Ruth Pickard came and compared him approvingly to her own son, who was now nearly 2 and very serious. Reverend Kemp came and moved his eyebrows extensively over the baby's cradle, in a way that seemed both congratulatory and spiritually involved. The spring of 1884 brought the expanded cattle operation into full season, and Ford Harris and Ezekiel Torres were good men who knew their work, and the leases were producing well, and Harlan Creek was growing, A few new families arriving from the east. A new building going up on the main street. The population inching upward in the way of places that had found their footing and were beginning to expand in confidence. Alma went back to the school in September because she had arranged with the school board for a woman named Harriet Cole, who had recently arrived in town with her husband, to cover the classroom in the spring semester, and now she was back. She brought James to the school with her in the mornings until he was old enough to stay with Mrs. Hartley, who had become something between a grandmother and a force of nature in their household, and the children treated him with the proprietary fondness of people who felt they had some collective stake in a teacher's baby. Levi expanded the corral in the summer and added a fourth horse and began talking about adding to the house, a room off the back for James and another room if they needed it, which was the kind of future planning that had its own specific joy. He hired a carpenter named Beaumont who worked through July and August, and the house grew, and the shelf with the carved figures grew also because Levi kept carving and the shelf kept filling, and they had to add a second shelf below the first, a growing gallery of small wooden lives. James began to walk in January 1885 with the aggressive confidence of a boy who is not interested in the cautious approach, lurching across the main room of the limestone house with considerable velocity and no particular concern for furniture. He had his father's pale gray eyes and his mother's chin, and a laugh that arrived suddenly and completely, like weather. The letter from Thomas in Illinois came in the spring of 1885. Her brother wrote irregularly, and she wrote back with equal irregularity, but they maintained a correspondence that was, if not warm, honest enough to be useful. This letter was longer than usual. Thomas wrote that his wife Sarah had softened in her opinions, and that Thomas himself regretted the distance that had grown between them, and he wrote with something that was as close to an apology as his nature probably allowed, which she accepted in the spirit it was offered. He also wrote that he and Sarah were considering a journey west in the summer to meet Levi and James, which was information she carried to Levi that evening with a complex combination of feelings. "Do you want them to come?" Levi asked. "I want my brother back," she said. "I am less certain about Sarah." "We have a spare room," Levi said, which was his way of saying, "Family is worth the complication." Thomas and Sarah came in August, the former taller than she remembered and the latter thinner, and they stayed for 2 weeks. It was not entirely easy. Sarah was exactly as Alma remembered her, but apparently working genuinely hard at being different. And Thomas was Thomas, careful and a little stiff, but under it all the older brother she had grown up with. Levi was himself with them, steady and warm and direct in a way that Alma knew could be taken as plain or could be taken as completely genuine, and Thomas seemed to take it as genuine by the end of the first week and was visibly easier for it. By the end of the second week, Sarah was playing with James on the porch in the afternoons with a delight that was either genuinely felt or extremely well performed, and Thomas had ridden out with Levi twice to see the cattle operation and come back both times looking like a man who has been reminded of something he values. They left on a Monday morning in late August, and Thomas hugged her at the stage office, a real hug, and said he was proud of her, and she believed him. The fall of 1885 brought the second pregnancy, announced in October with the same careful accumulation of evidence as the first, delivered to Levi in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. This time the stillness was shorter and the expression arrived faster, already well practiced on its own face. "2," Levi said. "2," she confirmed. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her with a thoroughness that made James, playing on the floor with a small wooden horse, look up and observe them with an expression of 1-year-old philosophical uncertainty. The second child was a girl, born in June 1886, with her mother's brown hair and an expression at 2 days old that Delia Foss described as having opinions already. They named her Clara, not for Levi's former engagement, but for no particular reason except that both of them liked it, and she arrived into the limestone house on Sycamore Road as if she had been there all along and was simply now making it official. James, who was 2.5, approached his sister with a combination of extreme caution and obvious proprietary interest, the caution prevailing in the first few days and the interest winning comprehensively by the end of the first week. He brought her one of his wooden horse figures, the one he had claimed from the shelf as specifically his, and placed it carefully beside her sleeping form in the cradle, which made Alma cover her mouth with her hand and Levi look away for a moment in the direction of the window. The shelf by this point held 23 carved figures. Levi had not stopped carving, and she had not stopped noticing the new ones, each one a small story, a small record. There was a teacher at a board. There was a man on horseback looking at a canyon. There was a woman wading in a creek with her boots in her hand. There was a baby being held up toward a window in early morning light. There was a man and a woman at a table with 2 cups between them, heads together, reading. She had added 3 of her own by 1886, crude compared to his but improving. One was a door, just a door with a number above it, 14. One was a stage coach. One was a letter, a folded paper envelope, tiny and carved from a pale piece of cedar. The story of how they had found each other was in the shelf. Anyone who knew how to read it could see it there, in the small wooden figures and what they held. It was the summer of 1887 when the question of a bigger operation became something they needed to formally address. The 2 cattle leases were producing extremely well, and Ezekiel Torres had become something close to a full partner in the day-to-day running of the cattle, and Levi had been approached about purchasing rather than leasing a substantial piece of land north of town that had become available when its elderly owner, a man named Prentice Dobbs, had decided to return to Virginia where his daughter lived. The land was good and the price was fair, and it was the kind of decision that turned a modest operation into a real ranch. They talked about it over 3 evenings at the oak table after the children were asleep, going over the finances with the same practical clarity they brought to every significant decision. And Alma had kept careful accounts since they married because she was organized, and because it mattered to both of them to build on clear ground, and the numbers supported the purchase if they were careful in the first 2 years. "There is something I want you to know," Levi said, on the 3rd evening. She looked up from the account book. "The money I came back to Harlan Creek with," he said, "the money I used to buy this house. I have always been uncomfortable about whether any part of it came through that operation in Wyoming that I told you about. I left before the worst of it, but I was there long enough that I received wages for some of that time." Alma set down the pen and looked at him, this man who had been carrying this particular weight for years and had chosen now, in the middle of a conversation about land purchase, to put it on the table between them where she could see it. "You have been uncertain about this for a long time," she said. "Yes. Is there a way to know? I have tried to calculate it," he said. "The wages that came from the legitimate cattle work versus the time when I knew what was happening. My best estimate is that perhaps 1/3 of what I saved in those years could have come from the wrong side of that operation." "What would you want to do about it?" she asked. He had clearly thought about this. "There is a family," he said. "A family of Comanche people whose land was the first to be taken by that operation. I know their name. I know approximately where they are. I cannot give back what was taken, nobody can do that. But I can give something." He looked at his hands. "I thought perhaps I could set aside an amount from the sale of any property and make a payment. It would not be adequate, but it would be something I did deliberately and honestly." Alma looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, we will do that." The simplicity of her agreement seemed to move him deeply. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with all of it visible in his face. "The foundation," she said softly. "The foundation," he agreed. They bought the Prentice Dobbs land in September 1887 and made the payment they had discussed, sent with a letter to a contact in the county who Levi had been in cautious correspondence with for some months, and they never heard whether it was received with the spirit it was sent, but they had done what they could do, and that was enough. It was not nothing. The ranch, which they called the Sycamore Ranch without any particular grandiosity, because they were both people who liked the plain thing, grew in the way of something built carefully on good ground. By 1889, they had 4 full-time hands including Ford Harris and Ezekiel Torres, who had by now brought his younger sister Alina into town, a fact that Ford Harris had noticed with considerable attention. The cattle were good. The land was good. James was 5 and had his father's build and his mother's mouth, and could already name every bone in a horse's leg, because he had asked about it persistently enough that Levi had drawn him a diagram. Clara was 3 and had opinions about everything in a way that Alma found deeply familiar, watching a version of herself move through the world at a speed that suggested she had places to be. The schoolhouse was now full to 29 children because the town had grown, and the school board had agreed to add a second room, and there was talk of hiring a second teacher, which Alma helped to interview in the fall of 1889, selecting a young man named Wallace Crane from Missouri, of all places, who had a good calm manner and a thorough knowledge of mathematics that complemented her own strengths. The decade turned, 1890 arriving with a particular quality of significance that Alma felt consciously, standing in the kitchen on New Year's morning watching the pale light come up over the limestone and cedar of West Texas. 8 years since she had misread an address in tired lamplight in a boarding house in Missouri. 8 years since she had stood at the wrong door on the right street, and a man had asked her inside, and she had said yes. And the yes had been the most important word she had ever spoken. She was 32 now, and she knew herself with the thoroughness that 8 years of being genuinely known by another person teaches you. She knew that she was at her best when she was working towards something with her full intelligence, and that being useful was not vanity but necessity for her. She knew she was impatient with dishonesty in all its forms, and that she had a temper that was rarely visible but was real and had to be honored. She knew she needed quiet time the way she needed water, regular and non-negotiable. She knew she was capable of love at a depth she had not understood before Levi, a depth that had surprised her repeatedly over 8 years with its stubborn and growing quality, as if the well kept being deeper than the last time she had measured it. She knew Levi with the same thoroughness, his quietness that was not distance but depth. His absolute consistency, the person he was yesterday was the person he was today and would be tomorrow, which was not dullness but the most profound form of reliability she knew. His carving, which continued because it was genuinely the way he processed the world, thinking with his hands while his mind worked. His capacity for moral seriousness, the Wyoming question and the payment, and the way he had raised James and Clara to understand that being good was not about being comfortable, but about being honest. His love for her, which was not the swept-away kind, not the kind that rose and fell with circumstance, but the steady kind, the kind that was simply present every day, the same way the limestone walls were present, solid and load-bearing and there. On New Year's morning in 1890, Levi found her in the kitchen and stood behind her at the window and put his arms around her, and they looked together at the pale Texas morning coming in. "Another decade," he said. "Another decade," she agreed. James woke up loudly approximately 6 minutes later, and Clara followed him with her opinions. And the morning became a morning, breakfast and noise, and the particular beautiful chaos of a household with 2 children on a holiday. And the quiet moment at the window was gone, but it had been there, and she carried it with her. They added to the house again in the spring of 1890, a proper study for her with a door she could close when she needed to think, which Levi had suggested, because he knew her well enough to know she had needed it for years before she would have asked for it herself. She put her books in it and her account books and the small cedar letter she had carved, and a photograph of the 2 of them from their wedding that she had received from Delia as a gift, and which showed them on the steps of the First Methodist Church, Levi looking at the camera with his usual directness and herself looking at him, because she always had been and apparently always would be. The summer of 1890 brought a third pregnancy, which arrived with less surprise and no less joy, and was delivered in the form of a son in March 1891, who was named William after Levi's uncle, a man Levi had admired since childhood. William arrived with red hair that neither of his parents possessed, and that required several weeks of family accounting before anyone remembered that Alma's mother had been red-haired, which was received as explanation enough. He was a placid, observant baby who watched the world with an attention that made Dr. Reeves, now thoroughly acclimated to both the Dust and the Malone family, say he had the eyes of someone who was already thinking about it. James was 7 by now, serious and curious, and received his new brother with the formal gravity of a firstborn, acknowledging a development that he had had some time to prepare for. Clara, at 5, received her second brother with the proprietary energy of someone who had been considering the possibility of another opinion holder in the house, and had decided she was equal to it. The shelf of carved figures had long since expanded to 3 shelves, which covered the entire wall beside the fireplace, and had become the kind of feature that people who visited the house noticed immediately and asked about. Every figure had a story, and the stories were theirs, the life they had built figure by figure and year by year, and the wall of carved wood was the most accurate record she knew of how 2 people can build something real from a beginning as small as a misread word. Harlan Creek in 1892 had grown to over 500 residents. The school had 2 full teachers. The cattle industry in the county was substantial. The Sycamore Ranch was known as one of the well-run outfits in the region, which meant steady income and a reputation that made dealing with buyers and neighboring ranchers straightforward. Levi had the respect of the people he worked with in the uncomplicated way that comes from doing what you say and saying what you mean, consistently and over time. On an evening in October 1892, Levi came in from the corrals later than usual, and she heard him washing up in the kitchen, and then there was a longer silence than usual, and she found him standing at the wall of carved figures with his arms crossed, just looking at them. She stood in the doorway of the main room and watched him for a moment. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned and looked at her with the open face, the full one, the one that had once been guarded and involuntary and was now simply his face when he looked at her. "I am thinking that I have been the luckiest man in Harlan Creek for the past 10 years, he said, "and that I do not say it enough." She crossed the room and stood beside him, and they both looked at the shelf. "You made a house that was easy to walk into," she said. "That is not luck, that is who you are." He put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder, and they stood looking at the small wooden record of their life. The door with the number above it, the stage coach, the letter, the woman with her arms out, the woman mid-step with her chin up, the man in the doorway half-turned, the teacher at the board, the man and woman at a table with their heads together, the baby toward the window, the horses, the canyon, the water. William's first carved figure had appeared 2 weeks ago, a new addition, made by Levi from a piece of the pale cedar that grew along the canyon rim. It was a small boy looking up. James had made his first carving attempt in the spring, a horse that was more interpretive than representational but was unmistakably a horse, and it sat on the lower shelf in the place he had chosen for it. Clara had announced in August that she was planning to carve a woman on a horse when she was old enough to use the knife, and had in the meantime drawn one on paper and pinned the paper below the shelf as a placeholder. The shelf was going to need to get longer, Alma thought. The family had a habit of adding to it. She looked at the small wooden door, number 14, that she had carved from cedar, the one that had started everything, the wrong door that was the right door, the door she had knocked on because of a word she had misread in her own tired handwriting, and she felt the full accumulated weight of 10 years of the right life, the life she had found by accident, the life she had built by choice. She thought about Ruth Pickard's question, asked in the church hall at the sewing circle in the first week she was in Harlan Creek. Do you love him? Meaning Hector Briggs. Meaning the arrangement she had come for. She had said, we have an arrangement. Which was honest. If Ruth asked her the question now about Levi Malone, about the life in the limestone house on Sycamore Road with 3 children and a wall of carved figures and a school full of children who mattered and a ranch built on honest ground, she would have a different answer. Yes, she would say. So completely and so easily that the question would answer itself in the asking. Levi kissed the top of her head and she turned into his arms, and they stood that way in the lamplight with the carved figures looking on. This small gallery of everything they had been and done and made together. And outside the Texas night was full of stars. And in the rooms down the hall 3 children were sleeping, James serious even in sleep, Clara no doubt mid-opinion even unconscious, baby William with his red hair and his observant eyes taking in whatever babies take in when the house is quiet. The door was still there on the shelf, the small cedar door with the number 14 above it, the wrong door, the right door. She would not have changed a single letter of that Misread address for anything in the world. In the spring of 1893, Alma discovered she was expecting their 4th child, which arrived in December, a second girl they named Ruth after the young woman who had asked the honest question at the sewing circle years ago, and who, when told the honor, cried with her characteristic whole-body completeness, and said it was the nicest thing that had ever happened to her. Ruth Malone arrived in December 1893, with her mother's brown hair and her father's gray eyes, and an expression of equanimity that suggested she had already made her peace with the world, and was prepared to be delighted by it. Levi carved her a figure the week she was born, a tiny curled form no bigger than his thumb, and placed it on the shelf among all the others, in the spot he had been holding open since October. The family was complete, 4 children and a limestone house on Sycamore Road, and a ranch built on honest ground, and a wall of carved wood that held all their stories, and a love that had started with the smallest possible error, one word misread in lamplight, and had grown from that unlikely and fortunate seed into something so large and rooted and real that no storm this country could deliver was ever going to move it. Harlan Creek grew and the world moved and the children grew taller and the shelf eventually ran the entire length of the wall and half of another. And at the center of all of it, unmoved and uncomplicated, was the carved cedar door with the number 14, the beginning of the whole beautiful, improbable, absolutely right thing.